He was just seconds away from hammering the final nail into what many believed would be the coffin of this so-called big, beautiful bill. That shocking whisper echoed through the corridors of power on a tense Saturday night in the United States Senate. Rumors of an impending collapse were rife, with some staffers insisting that the legislation, President Donald Trump's self-proclaimed masterwork, would never see the light of day. So, what exactly was lurking behind these rumors? And how did the Republican Party come so perilously close to dismantling the very proposal their leader had championed? Today we are diving deep into the high-stakes drama that bubbled up when Senate Republicans raced against the clock to push President Trump's immense piece of legislation, often referred to by his own boisterous phrase as the big beautiful bill, over a critical procedural hurdle. We will explore the bitter intra-party feud over Medicaid adjustments and the intricate wrangling behind the scenes that nearly sent this bill into an eternal slumber. In this expose, you will discover who flipped from a defiant no to a spirited yes in the 11th hour, how a hush-hush negotiation in a certain Senate office shifted the entire trajectory, and why Vice President J.D. Vance was hovering in the hallways with a tie-breaking mission that would transform him from a potential deal closer into a real-time mediator. If you think that is exciting, we have only just begun. Keep watching for the inside scoop on the reading of the entire 940-page legislative colossus forced by Senate Democrats. Revelations about changes to the state and local tax deduction that sent shockwaves through both chambers. And the survival of a crucial set of expansions aimed at helping rural hospitals. Ready? Then buckle up. All right, let us rewind the clock to that fateful weekend. Senate Republicans, after grappling for days in closed-door meetings, were forced to produce a reworked edition of the bill just moments before the stroke of midnight on Saturday. The corridor buzzed with speculation. Would the new draft mollify naysayers and holdouts, or would it ignite another round of arguments that might destroy the fragile base of support needed to advance the legislation? Tensions soared as the final collection of votes hung in the balance. With the 4th of July creeping ever closer, Republican leaders were desperate to deliver President Trump the legislative victory he had promised the nation, painting it as a shining example of his leadership and ability to achieve the improbable. The legislative mechanics behind this controversy might sound mundane, but the stakes were astronomical. The one question on everyone's lips: could the Republicans secure a majority on the initial procedural vote, known in the Senate as motion to proceed, which would unlock a grueling 20-hour debate on a measure stuffed with everything from energy tax credits to new guidelines for Medicaid? The final number, when it was eventually revealed, came down to 51 in favor and 49 against. That razor-thin margin was the result of single-minded management by Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who could only afford to lose 3 votes among the Republicans. Now, do not let that bland procedural name fool you. Obtaining a positive motion to proceed was a roller coaster. Just ask Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Going into the weekend, he was loudly opposed to the bill, calling the text unacceptable and urging the party to step back and craft a more measured approach. But, come time to cast the all-important vote, Senator Johnson dramatically switched his stance, forging a path to success for the Republican plan. According to whispered accounts, the pivot was hammered out behind closed doors, with Senator Rick Scott of Florida, Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming, and Senator Mike Lee of Utah all coaxing Johnson and, by extension, Vice President J.D. Vance in tow. Vance had been summoned, prepared to break a tie if the edge turned out to be 50-50. That did not happen, but Vance's presence became an additional layer of drama. Would he be forced to cast the deciding vote that could either move the entire plan forward or tear it to shreds? At the crux of the showdown were a handful of Republicans who did not relish the idea of being the 4th no vote, the one that could mortally wound the bill. They paced nervously, conferred with staff, and fielded a wave of backroom calls. Hours ticked by with the Senate floor standing in a kind of suspended animation. Parliamentarians, legislative directors, and interns all watched with bated breath, uncertain whether the final count could be secured. Senate leadership decided to keep the voting open for nearly 4 hours, an extraordinary stretch of time rarely seen in the hustle of daily legislative business. Senator Thune, known for projecting calm, grew visibly concerned as multiple factions within his party demanded last-minute concessions. When the dust cleared, the Republicans squeaked by on that initial roll call, which proved to be only the first major hurdle, albeit a monumental one. Amid the clamor, many wondered if the debate itself would commence right away. but Senate Democrats had a few strategic cards of their own. Given the momentous nature of the legislation, they declared their intention to force the reading of all 940 pages of this sweeping measure. The practice is a centuries-old tactic that drives exhaustion, frustration, and lengthens the timeline. For a bill jam-packed with details on Medicaid, provider taxes, energy provisions, and the highly contentious state and local tax deduction, reading each and every line on the Senate floor would be no small feat. Some insiders suspected that Senate Democrats hoped the plodding recitation of every clause and subclause would gin up more public skepticism of the Republican plan. So, what exactly did critics and cautious supporters alike dislike about the new iteration of the big, beautiful bill? The short answer? Plenty. Among the most divisive elements loomed Medicaid. Certain Republican senators wanted to see a structural realignment that gradually curbed federal contributions and gave states greater control. Others found that approach extreme, worrying about the political fallout of rolling back coverage, especially in states that had expanded Medicaid programs. Notably, Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina was adamantly opposed to the plan in its current form, stating that it strayed too far from what had once been hammered out by the House. Another piece of the puzzle was the Medicaid provider tax rate, an intricate formula that determines how states can leverage funding streams for health coverage. The Senate attorneys and legislative gurus had combed this area of the bill extensively, only to realize that its language would likely violate the Byrd Rule, a set of arcane parliamentary guidelines that prevents certain provisions unrelated to the budget advancement from being shoehorned into a reconciliation measure. As a result, top Republicans had to strip or rework many sections, including the timing of those provider tax changes, shifting their implementation date back by at least 1 year. Despite those adjustments, several senators insisted on more sweeteners. Senator Susan Collins of Maine fought for a brand new Rural Hospital Stabilization Fund, a multi-year plan that would funnel billions into small communities in desperate need of healthcare investment. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri insisted on additional clarifications around direct payments to states, wanting to ensure they would not inadvertently encourage higher deficits. And in the swirling heart of all these controversies, White House officials simultaneously pressed for quick approval, warning that a delayed bill could stoke political chaos. Privately, aides reminded senators that failure to pass President Trump's pet project could stamp the party as spineless and incompetent. Ultimately, in the wee hours leading up to the final text, a new pot of approximately $25 billion, spread across 5 years, was carved out for those rural hospitals. It was enough to earn Senator Collins's favor, at least for the procedural vote. She explained that while she supported advancing the bill for debate, she might well vote against final passage if some of her bigger concerns remained unresolved. She was not alone. Senator Tillis emerged, eyebrows furrowed, reaffirming that he would not get on board with final passage unless the Senate version pivoted back to something closer to the House's original approach. That tension between the House and Senate versions has become a hallmark of this entire legislative journey, fueling speculation that the final text might bounce repeatedly between the two chambers unless a grand compromise is crafted. Another hot-button issue that trudged on was the SALT deduction. In a previous House measure, the state and local tax deduction was capped at $40,000 for 5 years, after which time it would revert to the pre-existing $10,000 ceiling. High-tax states clamored for an even bigger adjustment, believing that limiting SALT deductions would harm middle and upper-middle-class families. Meanwhile, a handful of budget hawks within the Republican caucus worried that such expansions would slash too deeply into the federal revenue stream at a time when the government was facing mounting debt. Nevertheless, the House's version endured in the Senate, albeit with minimal tweaks to keep the process moving. In yet another testament to the labyrinth of competing interests behind this legislation, certain unique carve-outs found their way into the bill. One such example was an expansion of nutrition benefit waivers for the people of Alaska, championed by Senator Lisa Murkowski. Additionally, occasional references to a tax cut for whaling boat captains appeared within the text, raising eyebrows across the political spectrum, but also underlining the influence of single-issue advocacy groups. These inclusions, as bizarre as they might sound in isolation, reflected the complex art of negotiation. You give one senator or one region a pivotal concession, and in return, you secure the votes you need to keep the measure afloat. On the other side of the ideological spectrum, Senator Lee of Utah withdrew his open land sale provision to appease lawmakers from Montana and Idaho. Environmental concerns loomed over that aspect, with activists claiming it would encourage rampant privatization of scenic landscapes. Cynics might say that the patchwork of additions and subtractions produced a final text that was both messy and unrecognizable from the pristine policy blueprint many Republicans initially had in mind. Nevertheless, one could argue that such is the nature of legislating in a closely divided Senate. Each faction can hold the entire process hostage unless their demands are acknowledged. Given that the Republicans had a narrow margin for error, only a few votes could slip out of alignment. No single senator wanted to carry the blame for sinking the bill. This dynamic inevitably bestowed enormous leverage on the holdouts. Individuals who typically receive scant national media attention suddenly found themselves in the spotlight, as their single vote could determine the fate of a measure that spanned hundreds upon hundreds of complicated pages. Of course, the fight did not end when the Republicans eked out a victory on that opening procedural scuffle. In fact, some might say that is precisely when the real work began. You see, once the Senate votes to proceed on a bill, the next stage is a marathon of amendments often referred to as vote-a-rama. During this period, any senator can propose an unlimited number of amendments, each of which must be given consideration. While such a process aims to ensure that every voice is heard, it can also devolve into a political circus, with grandstanding and rhetorical showmanship taking center stage. Democrats, sensing an opportunity, fully intended to use vote-a-rama as a chance to highlight unpopular provisions and press Republicans on sensitive issues. Whether that meant offering amendments pegged to coverage for pre-existing conditions or unveiling last-second expansions to certain social programs, they sought to brand the entire Republican approach as out of touch with mainstream America. Meanwhile, Republicans who were not 100% satisfied with the bill saw this as their final chance to shape it, presumably by adding or removing language to align it with their respective states' demands. If you are thrilled by these behind-the-scenes revelations, give this exploration a quick thumbs up. It might seem like a small gesture, but your support makes it easier for more people to discover the real story behind these puzzling legislative battles. Back on the floor, the spectacle was only half the story. Over in the House, Republicans who had initially passed their version of the bill watched anxiously. They understood that the Senate's final product would need to be reconciled with their own measure to produce a single piece of legislation that the president could sign. In that sense, the Senate was merely the second major player in a complex dance. If the Senate indeed completed its process in time to sneak the measure back across the Capitol before the 4th of July, House leaders would then have to decide whether to accept or reject the changes. And if that is not complicated enough, consider the possibility that certain House Republicans might balk at the Senate's concessions on Medicaid, rural hospital funding, or even the SALT deduction. Every time major modifications are made, political alliances can shift like desert sands. Perhaps the most remarkable twist in this entire saga is President Trump's unwavering commitment. In an administration policy memo, he made it abundantly clear that rejecting this bill would be, as the text declared, the ultimate betrayal. That is a dramatic statement indeed. While presidents often work to shape legislation that reflects their campaign promises, rarely does such a direct warning ripple across Capitol Hill, reminding lawmakers that their seats and their reputations might be at risk if they do not deliver. Nonetheless, many are speculating what the White House's final reaction would be if further modifications diluted Trump's grand design. After all, for a bill of this magnitude, certain legislative changes are inevitable if it is to pass muster with the Senate's rules. In the swirl of drama, it is easy to forget that actual people, families across the country, would be affected by changes to Medicaid, by expansions of certain tax credits, and by modifications to how states manage their finances. Supporters of the bill have argued passionately that passing these reforms would jumpstart economic growth in underserved areas, while critics have warned that it might cause unwelcome shocks to healthcare infrastructure, especially for the neediest populations. Ultimately, the final text aims to address these concerns by walking a tightrope between cuts, expansions, and targeted reforms. Satisfying everyone, however, is about as likely as persuading a tornado to calm down. The next big question: will the Senate, after devouring thousands of pages of dense legislative language and surviving the vote-a-rama endurance test, finalize the bill and push it forward before that special Independence Day deadline? Determined staffers remind us that the impetus to finalize the measure by the 4th of July is more than symbolic. Delays this late in the year can cascade into budgeting headaches for multiple federal agencies. Meanwhile, supporters cling to the hopes of a holiday victory lap, one that might shore up public confidence in the Republican agenda heading into subsequent elections. The clock is ticking, and for some senators, the stakes extend well beyond this single law. But do not let anyone tell you that the final passage is a done deal. Senator Collins, for instance, has foreshadowed her potential shift to a no vote if certain demands are not met, and Senator Tillis remains obstinate on the Medicaid language. The tension could erupt at a second's notice if yet another faction of Republicans decides that a certain sweetener or compromise is missing. The ghost of prior major bills that floundered in the final stage looms large around these halls. Even the slightest misstep in negotiations could unravel days of progress. In the event that the Senate does complete its marathon of amendments, the measure technically returns to the House. That is where a brand new face-off could unfold. Some House Freedom Caucus members might rekeel at the Senate's expansions to Medicaid or the new funds for rural hospitals, seeing them as borderline capitulations to big government ideals. On the other hand, more moderate House Republicans may find themselves celebrating these additions, seeing them as essential to meeting their constituents' real needs. In truth, the entire process is a lesson in how complicated it is to pass large-scale legislation in a democracy brimming with diverse viewpoints. As this legislative spectacle edges toward its conclusion, it is anyone's guess whether the final text that lands on President Trump's desk will be greeted with enthusiastic cheers or a quiet grimace. Yet Trump's inner circle remains confident, citing the public appetite for relief in critical areas like healthcare and taxation. They tout the successes of forging unity in a fractious Senate as proof that anything is possible when you have the right leadership in place. Detractors, on the other hand, see this entire fiasco as prime evidence of how dysfunctional the system has become, with outsized influence given to a handful of senators who can hold an entire legislative process hostage. If you do not want to miss any twists or turns in this political saga, consider subscribing to stay updated on each new chapter as we unveil it. If you enjoy deep dives into important legislative battles, your support can help us keep producing these analyses. Still, in spite of the endless politicking, the controversies, and the bitter family feuds within the party, the promise of delivering a signed bill to President Trump by the 4th of July remains a potent motivator. Dramatic though it may be, the clock is ticking, and every senator is keenly aware of that. The tension crackling in the air is palpable, with even the slightest rumor of betrayal sending shockwaves through closed-door huddles. Staffers can be seen scurrying through the marble corridors, clutching binders stuffed with proposed amendments. And what about the president's vision for the future, that big, beautiful bill he has touted from campaign podiums to the Oval Office? Will it emerge from the trenches of the Senate battered and bruised, or mostly intact? Will the public see actual relief in their tax bills, refined healthcare options, and restructured support for nationwide infrastructure? Senate Republicans believe they are on the verge of delivering a landmark piece of legislation that could reverberate for decades to come, reshaping the tax code, upending traditional healthcare frameworks, and giving states more autonomy than they have had in years. For some, this entire fiasco represents a cautionary tale about big promises made on the campaign trail that crash into harsh reality. For others, it is a testament to the resilience of the legislative process, the idea that, after enough negotiation and compromise, a workable outcome can emerge, albeit one that might look drastically different from the original vision. Whether you cheer for it, fear it, or remain undecided, one thing is for sure: pass or fail. This exercise is unveiling the real power centers in Washington, the central characters that can make or break a president's greatest ambitions. As the final hours tick down, rest assured that the negotiations will be fierce, the emotions raw, and the rhetoric explosive. Allies will become adversaries in the blink of an eye, and unexpected alliances may blossom as the process winds its way to a dramatic close. The entire Capitol is bracing for the possibility of an all-nighter, or maybe 2 or 3, as lawmakers line up to propose amendments that might scuttle or salvage the measure. In addition, that reading of the 940 pages is still hovering in the background, an epic test of patience for those unsuspecting souls charged with reciting or listening to it. By the time the final version hits the Senate floor for that culminating vote, senators will be both fatigued and fired up, aware that each aye or nay could shape not just the immediate political landscape, but potentially the next election cycle and beyond. Senators with presidential ambitions might weigh how their vote will be perceived on the national stage. Senators in swing states might agonize over how their constituents will judge their choice. In short, the final passage is an event that goes far beyond typical legislative business. It is a statement of priorities, trust, and vision for what the country could become. If, by chance, the Senate does indeed approve the measure in the early hours of a bleary-eyed morning, it will set in motion a frantic scramble in the House. Lawmakers there will have little time for celebration or despair as they race to get the unified text onto President Trump's desk. The holiday backdrop only amplifies the drama, turning the 4th of July, a festive date typically awash in fireworks and patriotic speeches, into a referendum on whether Washington's Republicans can actually deliver on their marquee policy objectives. For the true policy buffs among us, seeing how the final bill addresses Medicaid coverage or state and local tax limitations is crucial. These details will determine the legislation's real-world impact and shape whether it is remembered as a meaningful accomplishment that improved lives or an overhyped experiment that left constituents disheartened. Meanwhile, President Trump is all set to wave the final product as proof of his administrative prowess, provided it aligns closely enough with the original blueprint. The question remains, can the party unify behind him, or will internal rifts derail what should have been a unifying moment? And that, my friends, is where we stand, a breath away from history in the making, with a swirl of controversies, alliances, betrayals, backroom maneuvers, and last-minute horse trading that would make even the most hardened political veterans' heads spin. Will Republicans close the deal swiftly, or are we about to witness yet another dramatic collapse? We will soon find out. Until then, keep your eyes peeled on the Senate floor, on the frantic staffers hustling from office to office, on the wary lawmaker who might change a vote at the final instant, and on the press conferences where triumphant or crestfallen senators will attempt to shape the public's perception of what actually went down in the heart of the Capitol. One thing is absolutely certain. If this big, beautiful bill does manage to survive its final gauntlet, it will be etched into the annals of modern American politics as a prime example of how narrow majorities, strong personalities, and conflicting ideologies all collide head-on in the legislative arena.